informal chat. So, meeting formally open. So welcome to this session on the Matchgirls strike. Our speaker is Louise, who tells me is a labour historian from a trade union background as opposed to an academic background. And I'm sure most of you know that she's the author of Striking a Light, history of the Bryant May Matchgirls strike. So she's going to talk for kind of 30-40 minutes, something like that, and then we'll, particularly because it's a select gathering, we'll have time for discussion.
If I see anyone nodding off, I'll wind it up. I just congratulate you on your lovely top back there, I just say. Nice. Well, I suppose being in the church, I should say, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to talk about an unholy row, see what I did there, that was happening in 1888 in the streets of the East End. I think we've got space to join us. And why this strike, which you may have heard of, you may not have heard of, you may have read the book on, you may not, is so important but still quite underplayed in terms of its importance. And when I do talk to someone, it's an interesting case. People have either know a lot about the strike, they maybe done it at school, they've always grown up knowing about it, or they know nothing at all. If you're in the former camp, you might think, wow, I've got to sit through this again, but there are really important flaws in the traditional version. And your friend and mine, I don't know if you know this, but your friend and mine, Michael Gove, mentioned the matchwomen in the Houses of Parliament just about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I normally have to I do talk to the NUT a lot, but I normally have to pause for booing whenever I say Michael Gove. But so you might think, well, it's already a very well-known strike then, but what's so interesting is that Michael Gove, surprise, surprise, got the story wrong. Thank goodness he's not in charge of school history, or no, he is. Got the version of the strike, got the story mangled, and got the version wrong. Very important the ways he got it wrong, but he was only as wrong as most historians have been. The story's been mentioned in a few books about the period. There's never been a single study book of it until like my own, basically. It makes an ideal early Christmas present, by the way. But a lot of historians have talked about the matchwomen strike, just like Michael Gove did, in terms of Annie Besant, who was a Fabian, middle-class Fabian socialist, helping, as he said, helping the Matchgirls. Now you might wonder why he was talking about it at all. I certainly did when I got tweeted about it. But he was talking about it to say that, sort of terrible leftists like myself who are arguing that his new curriculum, new history curriculum, is a bit of a disaster and not very pro-Labour history. He was saying, well, no, au contraire. Look, we've got the story. We're going to talk about Annie Besant and how she helped the Matchgirls. We've got an actual woman. And some working class people too. Obviously they were helped by the middle class woman, but hey, there's chicks everywhere in my new syllabus. But that fits into the sort of Victorian version of the story, really. That's the great individuals, isn't it? It's Lady Bountiful, Annie Besant sort of sweeping down to the factory gates and saying, I say girls, come along, we're going out on strike and I'm going to help you. That's a very old-fashioned model, and it would suit Michael Gove, really, wouldn't it? But it's become clear to me over the years I've been researching this story that it's the sheer, appropriately enough for this festival, it's the dangerousness of what the matchwomen did. It was such a challenge to the status quo that these women, very young, some of them teenagers, very poor, Irish descent, which of course was really beyond the pale in those days, illiterate largely, factory workers, slum dwellers, could possibly have gone out and strike on purpose. For goodness sake, Victorian women were supposed to be at home, not on the picket line. And it was such a shocking idea that it was misinterpreted at the time. But what's so interesting is it's continued to be misinterpreted, and a lot of history has been revised. People have gone back over it. It stayed like this sort of fairy story, really, of this, gracious lady helping these poor little girls. So what really happened? In 1888, the story takes place in Bow in East London. Bryant May is an enormous commercial concern at this time. It's the biggest match manufacturer, bar none, in the country. It's also a huge exporter. And this is really important because they've got friends in government, and the government actually changed legislation to suit Bryant May because they're such a big political player. They're really one of the first big sort of fat cat capitalist global firms, the forerunner of everything that we see today. And by this time, the original Mr. Bryant and Mr. May, who were grocers and who were Quakers, one's dead, one's retired, and the Bryant family, the Bryant sons, have taken over, and they are really ruthless. There's none of your sort of vaguely soft-centred Quaker employment practices from them. So the odds are really stacked against the matchwomen. They are EastEnders, and EastEnder at this time has just started to be used, the term, and it's an insult. If you call someone an EastEnder, it's sort of fighting words, And they said at the time, if someone's an EastEnder, then reach for the gunpowder and knock away the spoons. You know, that's how bad it was. Bryant May, on the other hand, had got a good reputation still, really. Their products are everywhere, and there's still quite a cuddly reputation left over from the original Quaker founders, and they're a real household name. Somebody said the matchwomen are the lowest strata of society, and it's an insult to be considered an insult, a blot on your copybook to work at Bryant May. That's how bad things were. Why? Because they're factory girls, and the idea of them has polite society in the right fit with the vapors at this point. Not because women haven't worked before, women have always worked, you know, back as far as records began. You wouldn't think it when you look at later history, but they have always worked and gone on strike as well. But not so visibly. When you've got women working in family groups or on farms, you can say, oh, well, that's just the little ladies doing their family duty, helping their husbands, helping their fathers. But factory girls are working independently, they're getting their money paid into their own hands, and this is really has got the middle classes in a real uproar, especially as they're a bit lippy and they tend to march down the streets of a lot of cities and towns sort of arm in arm, being cheeky to passers-by. You know, this will never do. It's been said that the Victorians had three archetypes, three female archetypes. So you could take your pick between ideal wife and mother, celibate spinster, or promiscuous prostitute. So careers lessons must be really interesting in girls' school at this time, wasn't they? But you'll see no working women, but in practice, working women were pretty much included in the prostitutes. That's where the euphemism working girl comes from, this period. Because it was so shocking that working alongside men. Some of them working down the mines, you know, might not have been, if you were crawling along putting a coal cart strapped to your waist, as a lot of these young girls were, you might not have been formally dressed, you know, one might remove one's bonnet, take your gloves off. And this was really causing shock and a bit of slightly titillating element as well. I looked at labour reports at this time, and there's one from a mining commissioner in the 1860s, and there's sort of these line drawings of, you know, half-naked women down mines. It's a little bit flashy off colour. And he says you can't imagine any sight more disgusting or revolting than these girls at work. No brothel could beat it. Which makes you think, I wonder how he did his research on that. But he doesn't share that with us. But this is the kind of tone, anyway. This is how women are being looked at. They're being blamed for high child mortality, drunkenness among the working classes. Everything's being blamed on working women just like the matchwomen. So the matchwomen, no trade union, no job security. Hired by the day, unions in those days tended to organise the skilled workers, the sort of top-hatted craftsmen. We're often told today, aren't we, that unions do nothing but interfere in the sacred working relationship, you know, between employer and employee, and if unions would just leave the workplace, things would be better, because employers would be more prosperous and they're the wealth creators, aren't they, and they'd give more money to their workers if they were just left alone. Well, we can take Bryant May as a case in point, because they're getting 20% dividends on their shares, which is, you must admit, is a pretty good rate of return. So how wonderfully are their workers doing? Well, all that's trickling down to the matchwomen is certainly not anything you want trickling down onto you. They are starving, basically. Annie Besant does interview the women at this point. She writes an expose of Bryant May at this point. And she tells us that immediately she went to interview some of the girls outside the factory gates, she could see how frail 10 years previously. The youngest girls, because they're growing physically while they're earning starvation wages and they can't eat properly, they're just not growing or developing normally. They also tell her that wages are low enough already, but also Bryant May are fining us. Now, actually, this was illegal. But they were imposing fines for the most arbitrary reasons, having dirty feet, how that would affect your ability to make matches, I don't know. One girl said, well, I was fined, as an example, because a machine was cutting our fingers. The webbing of it was cutting our fingers. So I made it safe. It still worked, but I made it safe. And the foreman was furious when he found out, and he probably gave her a clip around the ear, they tended to, and said, put that back how it was, that's more valuable than you are. And the next week, her workmate lost her fingers. She had 2 fingers severed by the same machine, and of course she was sacked. You can't make matches without the full complement of fingers. No sickness benefit, no compensation in those days, just out the door. But what the women feared most, and they were quite a fearless bunch, but what really terrified them was Phossy jaw. You might have heard about Phossy jaw if you've heard about the strike. This was actually phosphorus necrosis from white phosphorus. Didn't have to use it. Red phosphorus was a safe alternative. Bryant May put the business case as, you know, producers will, and they said, well, what can we do? basically. The punters want this particular type of match, which can only be made with white phosphorus, so, you know, our hands are tied, what can we do? It was worse at Bryant May's even than it needed to be, because there wasn't a separate workroom. Now, there should have been under the legislation, but there wasn't. So you'd bring in your little bit of bread from home, which is all you would eat every meal. You'd have bread and tea, and that was it. That was your lot. You put it on your workbench, and by the time you came to eat it, the particles in the air will have settled on the bread. So you've got poisonous seasoning, if you like, on your bread. And even inhaling very briefly particles of phosphorus could make you faint, could make you vomit. And in fact, when I was doing one talk at the Museum of London, someone said at the end, well, bless you, this is a high common character, said, my grandparents lived near the factory at this period, and they told me when I was a little boy that they could see the matchwomen's routes home because there were piles of fluorescing vomit in the gutters all the way around the factory, because it would also make you fluoresce. Your clothes would glow, even your skin would glow. This is, you know, highly unpleasant stuff. And I mean, it's been banned now as a weapon of war, hasn't it? It was used in Israel, I think, and it's been banned. You can't even use it to try to kill people with. That's how awful it is now. So how would it start? You would get a swollen face and jaw, as you expect from the name. And then, basically, I hope you haven't just had a late lunch or anything, but your jawbone starts to rot while you're still alive, and it's horrific, obviously. But also the abscesses that are formed, apparently the odour is so appalling that even loved ones can't stand to have sufferers under the same roof. So later I found that factory inspectors are saying, well, we found this group of matchwomen and men living on the outskirts of towns, which is almost like leopards, you know, the final stages of this agonising disease, and deformed, and, you know, jawbones completely gone. And you could die from it. It was a horrible way to die as well. It was a really agonising death from hemorrhaging. Bryant May now being, you know, again, a caring employer, you can imagine their precautions were marvellous. They sacked you if they thought you looked like you were coming down with it. So if you looked like you had a swollen face, and the women would disguise signs of toothache, because, although they knew about Phossy jaw, the need to eat on a daily basis and to feed your kids was just so pressing. You couldn't afford to look into the future. One woman I read, William Morris had a journal at this time, and I was reading a report in his journal around the time of the strike, and he said there was a story that one woman was pregnant and her face looked swollen, so the foreman said, right, you've got to have all your teeth pulled at once. No anaesthetic in those days. And because she thought, well, I'll probably miscarry, you know, the shock, what will the shock do to the baby? She refused, and so they sacked her. So there you go, that's what you get when you have no trade union. So this is Besson's article. Most of that was in her article. It's quite a short piece, but very hard-hitting, and she actually called it White Slavery in London, and she concluded that slaves would have been better off because it would have cost Bryant May more to feed and house a slave, so they were fit and strong and able to work, than these women were getting paid. They were getting an absolute pittance, just a few shillings. This piece comes out in her own paper, The Link. A few days later, the women walk out on strike, and Bob's your uncle. History's concluded ever since. Well, there you go, Annie Besant led the strike. That's where I came in, really, as a trade union steward and activist myself, you know, enemy of promise, as Michael Gove would call me, proudly wearing that badge. I was really interested. I thought, well, I've worked from the East End, and I've sort of been involved in strikes, and I just couldn't imagine how to get from Annie Besant is a Fabian. Yes, so you can call them socialists at this period, not massively revolutionary, but you can call them socialists. But how do we get from there to 1,400 women, desperately dependent on their wages, suddenly going out on strike? Does she go down to the factory gates and say, I say, girls, the Fabians started to have a vote, and we've decided you're all going out on strike? Can you imagine what the response would be from a load of tough East Enders? It wouldn't have been, oh, God bless you, Mum, yes, we'll be there, put it that way. So I had to write an essay on a labour history course. I'd left school at 15, I was certainly not an academic, but I just thought, well, I'll go and have a look at the archives, you know, I'll just go and look at the original documents. Never expecting, thinking that perhaps I could, you know, pick up a few tips of how you organise a big strike, you know, never know, there might be some brilliant rhetoric that I can sort of pinch. The first thing is that Bryant May would really help me out by keeping everything, and I just waded it through all this material right up into the 60s and 70s. And I read, they had an original copy of her 1888 newspaper, not just the piece, the whole paper, so I read the whole thing. No mention of the strike in her articles. She calls for a consumer boycott, very common middle-class tactic at this time that the reformers were using. But then, a few pages on, she talks about this sort of rage for organising workers like this, what they call casual workers, what they called unskilled workers. And she says, this is a really bad idea, basically. And she says, for example, take the women of Bryant May that I wrote about in another column. How on earth could you organise them? If they went on strike, there's so many millions unemployed just in the East End alone that they'll just be sacked. And within hours, the foreman will be able to replace them. I thought, hello, this is rather surprising rhetoric for somebody who's apparently led a strike a few days later, but, you know, perhaps she's just concealing her motives, but didn't really sound like it. So, kept looking in the archives. And then I felt what really tipped me off that something was wrong here was I found a list the foreman had constructed. It was like the Bryant May naughty list of 5 girls they thought had started the strike, troublemakers. Thought, well, this is very strange. It either started within the workforce or without the workforce. You can't really have both. Looked at Fabian politics as well, quite anti-trade union if anything. They're certainly not rabble-rousing at this stage amongst the working classes, you know, really far from it. And I found evidence of previous strikes. Tom Mann writes about a strike of matrimony in the 1880s over Phossy Jaw, actually. So this wasn't the first time they'd been on strike by any means. So I drew up a little sort of very amateur timeline. Don't imagine this was in any way professional, you know, I wasn't sort of on Excel or wherever you go on, I was just sort of in the spare room with bits of paper, really. But what I found happened was quite different to the version of events we normally get. Bryant and May tried to force the women to go back on what Annie Besant had said, to say she'd lied. They wouldn't tell them who had spoken to Besant, but then they said, right, you have to sign this paper or you'll be sacked. And it said, you know, with the statement said, we love working with Bryant and May, they're just the best employers, they're marvellous, we couldn't be happier. They all refused to sign it. Now, they knew they'd be sacked immediately. What I always find so touching is not just that they wouldn't sign it, and the sort of loyalty and solidarity that they had for each other. We also know that they were feeling loyal to Annie Besant too, and they thought it was really important to them not to. They've been trying to get the poor girls to say it is all lies that has been printed and to sign a paper. We will not sign. What you have spoken is quite true, and we will not go back on you. We hope you will not get into any trouble on our behalf. I find that so touching. Annie Besant could really look after herself, but as far as they were concerned, she's done right by us, we're going to do right by her. So Bryant May then sacked one girl, very popular girl, who they sacked her as an example, really. They make an excuse for why they sacked her, but everyone knows why. Her workmates immediately down tools and they streamed out the factory site. If anyone knows the factory site, so it's a gated housing community now on Fairfield Road in Bowden. It's still there. It's an enormous site. It's really gothic looking from the outside. There's all these sort of towers and it's like a castle. So they all stream out of the biggest factory, which is in the middle of the site. What they do then, I think, is so interesting. The way these women are written about, the way the working class is generally written about at this time, you would imagine they just, well, if they did go out strike, they wouldn't know what to do then. They'd probably go down the pub or go home or go to the music hall. But no, they formed a picket line, actually, immediately. And they elected 6 women to go back into Bryant May and put their terms. And they widened them, not just reinstating to her, but an end to fines, a proper dining room, and so on. So, you know, it's pretty organised, really. Bryant May tell them where to go, but they won't go back. They go out, they get the other workers out, and they stay out on strike. And they parade the streets of the East End, singing rude songs about Bryant May, apparently. There's one bit of oral history that's lovely. Someone remembering the Matchgirls singing, you know, what they're going to do to Bryant May if they get their hands on them. Now, this is a heck of a shock. Women like this are not supposed to rebel in this way. This is terrifying. You know, there's a real fear of social revolution at this time. We know that police leave was practically cancelled all over the country, and police have rushed into the East End in battalions. It's terrifying, actually. Actually, they were quite scary. They're probably quite sensible. But, you know, the Victorian Women's Place was just not doing this sort of thing. It's an affront to the status quo. And you can see that in the newspaper reports. It's not this well-loved strike at the beginning at all. It's people saying, what do these women think they're playing at? This must be the socialists. They've upset them. They've confused them, you know. But Annie Besant is nowhere to be seen. That's what's so interesting. There's no Annie Besant. There is one quite militant tailors trade unionist who pops up at the factory gates, but there's no Besant. And I looked at her journal, and she talks about the women coming to see her, and she says, I'm working in my office, and there's a commotion. I look out the window, and there's this sort of gaggle of girls in the street below, and people can't get past. So she sends down a note asking, firstly, can you please move? And secondly, what do you want? And 3 of them come up and she gives them tea and says they're actually quite respectable. And they tell her she's on strike. Well, hang on a minute. Why this didn't ring alarm bells through history? You know, they told me they were on strike. Well, hang on, you led the strike. Surely you would know that. Not only does she not know it, but she writes in the next issue of the Link, "The girls will go back to work," big headline. She says, really openly, this is a mistake. Can understand that from her point of view. She doesn't really approve of organising workers like this. Well, neither did the trade unions, really. Neither did many of the associates at this point. You know, this is not how to go at any best day. But she really had no desire for them to do this. She was thinking, well, we've got no funds to support them, which obviously if you plan to strike, you'd have funds in place. And she's thinking, my God, we've got 1,400 women desperately poor on the streets of the East End. How on earth, you know, how are they going to eat? What are we going to do? But what she certainly doesn't do is say, you know, this is our glorious strike, and you know, you don't get the other Fabians like Bernard Shaw sort of going, whoopee, either. They're sort of like, oh my God, what's happened now? You know, we've got to go in and do strike funds now, and it's sort of, you know, interfering with their schedules. But the media now gets quite excited about this and starts to call it the Matchgirls strike and reports that it's causing an enormous sensation in the East End. The women march to Parliament, and this is so surprising to see again. East End women looking poor in the smart streets of London. But it stops the traffic literally, and people catcall them and boo them and call out insults to them, but they ignore them, hold their heads high, meet with MPs. The MPs are quite surprised. The segregation of the classes at this period is such that they may well not really have met really working class people like this before. Middle class MPs and journalists, you can tell it's all very new to them. But they're very impressed by how eloquent the women are. One of the girls gets in with MPs and she's got a bonnet on and she has blonde ringlets underneath apparently. And as soon as she's in the room with them, she takes off her hat, and because she's carried wooden pallets on her head of matchboxes since she was a girl, she's completely got no hair, completely bald on top of her scalp. Brilliant political gesture though, you know, and Annie Besant, nothing to do with this. Political pressure really grows on Bryant May now, and it's partly because lots of MPs and clergymen are shareholders, so you can imagine the press is starting to love this and really to embarrass the people who are in their day jobs are sort of, you know, championing the cause of the poor and privately are making 20% profits from their shares. And it's only this that forces Bryant May to give in. In around 2 weeks, they're forced to accept the women's terms, to have them all back, to give them a separate dining room, better rates of pay, to end these fines, and they are allowed to form what becomes the largest union of women and girls in the country at the time, the Union of Women Matchmakers. So when people say, as they often do, why don't you call them matchgirls? This political correctness gone mad. I say, well, they called themselves matchwomen, so, and some of them were married and had children. You know, this is really incredible, to go from being what, you know, the papers are, what today's email would call chavs, to go from being the lowest of the low, really looked down, really despised, to forming this huge union in a couple of weeks is absolutely extraordinary, really. But still, most historians have seemed to prefer the version, sort of Hans Christian Andersen, little matchgirl version that, you know, Annie Besant makes his girls go out on strike. This means that women have been left out of the sort of big prize, which is new unionism. The Great London Dock Strike happens in 1889, very close to where the match factory is. Sweeps the nation, practically a general strike, spreads to other countries as well. You know, the most exploited workers like the matchwomen, are taking matters into their own hands. They're forming their own unions. This is the start of everything we know today. The modern trade union movement, the Labour Party even, which of course is why Labour Party leaders traditionally love the trade union, especially the militant ones so much. But it's very important. You would think matchwomen therefore would be, you know, they went on strike first, you'd think they'd be considered at the forefront of it, but they're not. There are books on unionism which don't even mention the matchwomen strike at all, and there are many books where they're just dismissed as sort of, oh, it's a nice colourful story, but you know, a few girls went on strike because Annie Besant told them to, and it's, you know, it's not really hugely important. In order to prove that, there's quite a lot of hostility to my thesis that the women began the strike themselves. There's quite a lot of resistance to it, to put it mildly. So apart from proving that Annie Besant didn't lead the strike, I still had to prove that the women did. And I had people saying, well, they were so young and they wouldn't have, you know, they couldn't even read, they weren't educated. How could they possibly have done anything political, let alone important? Which is an interesting view really of the working class, but anyway. So I went back and looked at accounts of the match women, not the strike itself, but the match women. There are lots of accounts, and it's clear that they were quite famous in the East End even before the strike, or infamous, depending on your point of view. Very far from these helpless kind of waifs and strays that you might imagine though. It was said that you could tell a match woman by her clothes, for one thing, which were far too bright and far too sort of bling and fashionable for working class women. Should be much more modest. But what they liked were really bright clothes. They had particular hairstyles, particular sort of badges of identity, particular style of shoes. They liked little hats. They save up money, and then somebody would go to the milliners and buy some communal hats, which everybody would share. Again, they should have, as respectable women, bought little modest, preferably beige numbers, but they didn't, I'm afraid. They bought the biggest hats they could find with the most colourful feathers that they could get their hands on. And I suppose if you had a date with a docker on a Saturday night, you'd get the hats, and then you'd bring it back hopefully in one piece, and then someone else would get it the next day. I found a lovely quote from a bloke who was living in Potbury at the time. He said it wasn't the hats he had to worry about so much as the hat pins. And he said, these match girls were very tough, and on rare occasions when in any trouble, they didn't hesitate to use these horrible long hat pins to defend themselves. So they dressed to kill, literally, because these would have been pretty sharp. It's a pity that they didn't have them on them when, at this time, soon after they go back on strike, we've got Jack the Ripper. The murders are starting around this point, and there's a death threat, possibly a hoax, sent to the matchwomen after they go back to work. And it says, I'm going to visit your work girls. It's sent to Bryant May. I'm going to see what they have in their stomachs, and I'm going to take it out of them. The reason for this is signed Joe Ripper, and the reason for this, according to Joe Ripper, is that I hear they are beginning to say what they are going to do with me. So this is an interesting idea. There's general terror on the streets, but the matchwomen apparently are saying, wait till we get our hands on this so-and-so. And what a shame that a few of them with their hat pins, down some Whitechapel back alley one night, didn't, because history might have been very different. Another thing that historians have suggested is that the matchmen were far too different from other groups of new unionists. They'd never say how, presume they're new because they're women. I don't know, there's no other difference really. They all come from, the matchmen and the dockers, for example, and also some of the gas workers who are also agitating around this time. Real massive Irish heritage amongst all the groups. They're all EastEnders. And when I found names, because that was really key, finding the names of these women, because they're just never mentioned, they're just always the match girls. We know Annie Besant's name, but not theirs. Found addresses for some of the strikers in the strike committee, including some of the women who were on Bryant May's naughty list that I talked about earlier. And these were Kate Slater, not Cat Slater, but you can see it's a good old East End name, can't you? Mary Driscoll, Eliza Martin, Alice Francis, and Jane Wakelin. I found Mary Driscoll's granddaughter Joan and Eliza Martin's descendants as well. And the dock connections run right through. For example, Eliza Martin, her sister married a docker, her nephews went up to the docks, and her grandson, Jim, who's a London cabbie, I said to him, well, Jim, there is this academic theory that they're a very different group of workers. He said, well, that's a load of I'll leave it to the word he used. It's nonsense, basically. He said, Lou, that's rubbish. They're the same people. Everyone knows. Match girls and dockers went out together, got married. And when I looked at the census, it's absolutely true. They're in the same streets. They're in the same houses. They're in the same families. The connections run through and through and through. Would be odd if they didn't. Irish community, Match Factory, biggest employer of female casual labour, Dock's biggest employer of male casual labour. What have they not got in common, really? One of my favourite stories actually comes from Eliza Martin's family. They were talking about how the women of the family were very maternal, very loving to their family, but tough and didn't mess with them, and they would protect their daughters, and they had to in those days. The streets were pretty rough places. And Jim told me the story about one of Eliza's sisters. He said she's in the bookies, and a toff comes in, a posh person, which they're not used to seeing, so it's quite remarkable, in a top hat and everything. He stood behind her, and some of the local boys think, opportunity for a bit of fun here. There was no television in those days. You had to make your own fun, didn't you? So they reach round the top and pinch Eliza's sister from behind. She swings round, doesn't ask any questions, just sees this poor guy, this poor innocent toff, standing behind her, and knocks him out cold with one punch. Did not mess with the match women. Interestingly, the dock strike, you go back to the dock strike and look at the accounts and look at what the dock leaders said. They never denied the match women's influence. You can't get much more macho, I wouldn't have thought, in your ideas about gender than an East End docker in the Victorian period, especially of Irish extraction. You wouldn't expect to be kind of raging feminists, really. But they say, really openly, again and again, if you read accounts of the strike, we contacted the Match Women's Union for advice. Just after the victory in 1888, there was an attempted strike on the docks, which doesn't get talked about very often. It failed, but it was a rehearsal for what happened. And in the throes of the Great Dock Strike, this enormous, enormous strike, John Burns was addressing a mass meeting, which would have been hundreds of thousands of people. And he said, "Stand shoulder to shoulder, remember the Matchgirls who won their fight and formed a union." Now, how interesting that to all these people a year later, he just says the Matchgirls. He doesn't say the Bryant May women who worked over the corner. Remember they had a strike last year. He expects everyone to know exactly what he's talking about in that sentence and to be inspired by it. The Star newspaper, a very different newspaper to what we have today, was following the match strike and the dockers strike. And there's a lovely account at the end of the dock strike. Here's what they say. "Up come the dockers, then a large contingent of women, matchmakers among others, advancing like a moving rainbow, for they all wear the huge feathers of many colours they love to sport on a day out." I love that image of getting dressed up for a strike procession and wearing the best hat for that. That's a brilliant idea. So for so many reasons, I think, we owe these women so much was at stake here. I mean, Ernest Bevin, I found when I was researching the strike, wrote to the surviving dock strikers and gave them a commemoration medal in 1940, and he said, 50 years ago, you were among those involved in a great industrial upheaval, a revolution against poverty, tyranny, and intolerable conditions. You little thought during those weeks that you were laying the foundation of a great industrial movement. Well, quite. This is how high the stakes were in those days. Not just the dockers, though, that should be applied equally to the matchman. I think that's so important. And I think it's important not just that the past gets put right, but it's important for today. It's important for non-unionised workers today, for people in sweatshops, for people who've been badly treated at work. And we know there were so many disputes that remind me of the matchman strike. The Carillion care homes dispute, with lots of going women workers being appallingly treated and victimised by foremen. Migrant workers getting in the neck everywhere from the government, from the media. I think this is such an inspiring idea, and much better role models, I think, for young girls in the classroom than, what celebrities recently lost £20 or whatever it is. So I think it's really important to bring this story into the present as a bit of a rallying point. And whenever I was doing talks, I was saying, well, the 125th anniversary is coming up, and somebody should really do something, and everyone was just looking back at me, going, yes, they should. And that's how I found myself organising a festival, which I would not recommend for anyone's mental health at all. However, in about 5 months' time, 6th of July, there will be a festival at the Bishopsgate Institute. And we're going to have people like Frances O'Grady, the first woman, eventually you get there, the first woman head of the TUC, Irish background, and a big fan of the Match Women. And we've got performers like Michael Rosen, who will be doing a children's event, Attila the Stockbroker, Kate Hardy, Tony Benn, Owen Jones, brilliant speaker Owen Jones. Speakers in the day, broken up by a bit of music, traditional Irish music as well, and bands and comics and poets in the evening, and all for free. We're going to have a Make a Matchbox workshop where you've got to make matchboxes against the clock, and we'll let you know whether you've been able to pay your rents. I've tried making a matchbox. I would say probably not, because you have to make 244 to earn 2.5 pence. And I tried making one for the Who Do You Think You Are people thought it would be a lovely idea. And it was such a failure they had to cut it. I think I made about 0.5 of a matchbox in about half an hour and just all gave up. The Match Women would have approved of this sort of event, I think, not just the usual speakers giving the usual speeches, but a bit of a confectionery works women. And they had meetings involving Irish dancing, Irish music and tea and cake, so brilliant, we'll be having a bit of that. Probably some beer as well as some tea and cake though. I hope that you'll join us. I hope that you'll get all your associations to sponsor us as well, because we're doing it on less than half a shoestring, to put it mildly. All the information's on here, Facebook and Twitter and all. Do come along, bring your friends, and I hope to see you there. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got lots of time for debate and questions. So just stick your hands up.
Ask away.
It can be very informal, I think, this morning's meeting. So.
Or if you want to volunteer large amounts of money or stewarding on the day, that's also fine.
That too.
I'll steward on
Yeah, I was just wondering, assuming that they obviously weren't linked up with the failures or anything like that, I was just wondering how did they articulate what they wanted, not just for their own workplace, but for a wider society? Because one of the things that, I mean, I've obviously read I've read the traditional history, and it's all about not just that the new unionism was about unskilled and people who didn't think they could work, but that they were socialists. They actually had socialist ideas. You know, I'm from Baxley. I grew up in Baxley, where John Burns is based, and where all the strike took place, and they got into municipal government. I was just wondering, did they actually have a sense that they were creating a good society, as well as the immediate thing of creating just decent conditions?
I wouldn't go so far as to say they knew what they were starting. I don't know. There's no way, unfortunately, because it wasn't considered important enough to interview them at the time. I couldn't make that claim for them. But I do know that they were aware of socialist ideas, because there's one little bit that's been overlooked by history where when Annie Besant comes to talk to some of the girls outside the factory, one of them says, "We recognise you from socialist platforms," in other words, from meetings that Annie Besant has been speaking at, they've been there. In that note they write to her, they also say, not just, just to warn you, Bryant May are doing this and we won't go back on you, will you let us know if there are any more meetings? So they're wanting to know about political meetings. So not too far-fetched at all to say they had socialist ideas. I think the fact that they show so much solidarity is definitely political in itself. Whether, I wouldn't go so far as to say that any of them had sort of, Marxist or syndicalist or ideas they would have articulated as political, but I don't think that matters. I think what they did is, in its very essence, innately incredibly political and very socialist, albeit in a gut reaction way rather than a book-learned way. I've also looked at accounts from working class people of this period. I wish there were Matchgirls accounts, maybe one day I'll find one. But people who very, dockers' children have written memoirs and said, yes, we were, my dad was a docker, he used to take us on walks and say, look at those big houses and look at where you come from. But the people that come from those slums built those big houses, and all these kind of political ideas. There were political papers around, there was the Clarion Club, political ideas were there in the working classes very definitely. Some historians even now write about this underclass that's completely ignorant, no idea what's going on. And also very protectionist. If they've got any politics, they're probably just trying to scrabble over each other and, England for the English, and it's just simply not true. You can see again and again, if you actually look at accounts, that of course these people are aware of how exploited they are, of course they're picking up on ideas, and even those that can't read are desperate for knowledge. There's always stories about factory girls saving up, trying to buy books, any books they could get their hands on, being told to get their noses out of books and get on with their work. And people reading out newspapers on the street corners and everyone gathering around. So yes, they absolutely knew what people thought of them and what was being said of them. One of the Matchwomen's grandsons, who's going to be there and speak at the festival, actually, Ted Lewis, said, don't get away with the idea that they didn't know what was being said about them. They absolutely knew how the rest of society was putting them down. And they knew they were not considered ladies. They said that they were to me. They were great ladies. They were East End ladies. They're absolutely aware of their place in society.
Presumably some of the women went on to join the suffrage movement under Max. That must have been
presumably.
Starting.
Yes, at this time it is a very, very, very nascent idea about women's rights. There's no records on that. It would be great if there were, but I think it would be strange if some of them hadn't.
Yes.
Especially Sylvia Pankhurst's federation, the East London Federation of Suffragettes, the ELF. I can just see them actually, Matchwomen being the type that would have joined that. Whether they had a lot of time for political activity, of course, is another matter. Whereas the dockers, some of the dock strikers went on to become MPs, to write their stories, to become trade union activists. These are women with 6 kids, 8 kids, or more. And they don't really have the luxury. They do talk to their families about the strike and how important it was to them. but they don't, because they can't take any time off to really sort of, do laps of honour and sort of celebrate it. And as Ted said, I said, well, did your grandmother talk about it? He said, yeah, she talked about it, but whenever you went over to my grandmother's, she was always working up to when she was literally on her deathbed. She was still making matches with Bryant May. She died in 1960, Martha. She was working at the age of 6 in 1988. Or she'd be peeling onions for pickling, or she'd be, said you couldn't go around there for a cup of tea and just relax, forget, she'd be like, right, now you're here, peel those onions and so on. Just always, it's a constant battle against poverty, particularly for women at this period.
What happened to the Matchworkers Union? Did it actually get involved in amalgamations?
It did. It did, and it survived, which is quite. There's an American academic, his name I forget, who's written about the union and how terribly unimportant it was because it only survived to 1920. Well, firstly, a lot of unions didn't survive new unionism. As you can imagine, the employers were not having that for very long. All these burgeoning unions, they kick back, push back really hard, the employers. A lot of unions fold. But the Matchwomen's Union survives, has further strikes, and goes into the GMB, which is why I've got a cheque eventually out of the GMB for the festival. So, really kind of quite a proud heritage, really. And how anybody could say that that's not important, I don't know. But one of the funny things is that Annie Besant, memorialised the strike leader, said at the last meeting of the Matchwomen, she said, right, well, you're very lucky, you've been very lucky this time, you've got away with it. Bryant May, your employers will have you back, but don't do it again. You won't go on strike again, will you? And they sort of say, no, ma'am, but they do. They go on strike again quite consistently over Phossy, there are still instances of Phossy and so on. So really, fairly militant union and certainly a successful one, I would say.
Just about the socialist movement, you see, I think there was I once wrote at university, I wrote a paper about the 1880 socialist movement.
Yeah.
And I think that the problem was that the SDF, which was the first Marxist organisation, Hindman in particular had a dreadful attitude to trade unions.
And to women.
He didn't have, yes, and women and
everyone really.
He was the most disgraceful person.
Yeah,
he
wasn't much of a hero.
He was the father of British Marxism, but really, he was a terrible person.
Yeah.
And he lived in a damn big house in Hampstead.
Certainly did. Yes.
And he always addressed meetings in his top hat and frock coat.
Yep.
Congratulated workers on having made so much money for himself and his class.
Yes.
So, he was a weird person. But his theory was that he held on to what was called, was something Marx disagreed with, which was the so-called iron law sexists who don't care much about women, but they don't think the trade unions are that good an idea. I mean, Engels and Eleanor Marx in particular had a different
I love
attitude. I was going to ask, did she ever write anything about it or have anything to do with it?
Not about the Matchwomen's strike as such, because it was over so quickly. But after the strike, some shirt makers in Dublin wrote to the London Trades Council and said, we've heard about this strike that happened, and can you help us? We want to unite as well. And they sent Eleanor Marx over to Dublin. And they'd organised a great big procession, but she was early. So she walked through the streets of Dublin, they were like, not now, you're early. So she had to go back and do it all over again, which is a rather lovely story. But no, not the Matchwomen's strike, but of course the dock strike, massively involved. And she taught, was it Benny Tillett she taught to read and write? One of the dockers' leaders. Will Thorne, that's right, yeah. Will Thorne, she noticed that he couldn't read and write, and being Eleanor Marx, took the time to just tactfully, think, well, he's going to need to, because he's, a strike leader and to teach him, but he never forgot, yeah. Wonderful. But no, massive problems with socialism at this time, no wonder Karl Marx is saying, I'm not a Marxist then, when he's reading about some of the things that are going on. No, there are problems. There are real personality problems because the socialist revival is just a few groups really led by a few people, very strongly led by a few big figures, and yes, they are a little flawed. Who was it? Was it E. Belthorpe Baxley wrote a book called The Fraud of Feminism?
Yes.
Also, yes, kind of self-explanatory.
Anyone at the back wants to ask a question?
Can I go again?
Yes, we've got time.
John Burns, who was the main striker, she mentioned that he was a member of the SDF.
Yes.
They're not all bad.
Oh no, no, of course not. No.
But they tended to
sort of around Louise as well. They're
Yeah.
incredibly powerful.
Well, like William Morris was not particularly pro-union or pro-state action, so
No,
and he's the
absolutely.
godfather of socialism.
Absolutely.
You know,
And
he's
I
the
mean,
one that everyone loves.
George Bernard Shaw, who people think of as a socialist, and he wrote a wonderful book that I've got at home called The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Capitalism, Socialism and Trade Unionism. And it's sort of, well dear, here's what you need to know. You've probably heard people talking. We hadn't been talking about these before the 30s. And yeah, he says, it's appalling the amount of days that are lost to strikes. It's just terrible.
Yeah.
Trade unions are a bit of a disaster. Annie Besant goes on to then, I normally get lynched by an Annie Besant fan whenever I do a talk. I was speaking at the Sorbonne, I'd like to throw that in, I was speaking at the Sorbonne, in Paris and recently, and there were 3 massive Annie Besant fans. It was like the World Annie Besant Fan Club was in this room in Paris. And they were all saying, how could you, no, I won't do the accent, because the last time I did that, the first person who asked me a question afterwards was French, and it looked like I was doing some awful hello thing, which I hadn't meant to, I don't know how. And they said, how could you say this about Annie Besant? She was a wonderful woman, and it's not about her though. The point is not whether Annie Besant was wonderful or whether Annie Besant wasn't wonderful. In many ways, she achieved an awful lot. It's about the fact that she didn't lead the strike, and she said she didn't. She constantly said, for God's sake, it's not me. I didn't do this. She's at pains to point it out because she thinks it's a bad idea, as did Bernard Shaw, as did just about everybody on the middle class left at this time. And again, as I say, you can see why. But Annie Besant went on to talk about workers like this as being the mob of labour and say that, they do cost the sort of organised, respectable labour men many a battle because they're sort of a bit disreputable and they're these sort of, mobs, that unruly mobs. So that was very much everyone's thinking at the time. Yeah.
I'm going to go. What was it? I'm
Yeah,
going to go. This is just as a bit of an aside. You
Yeah.
mentioned about who do you think you are. Now, I remember Barbara Winton, and her, wasn't one of
That
her
was
ancestors?
that was me on that.
That was
I
you
was younger then.
And wasn't one of her ancestors a match?
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right, yeah.
It'd be great if she could come along.
It would be, I know. I did actually contact her agents.
Right.
But they sort of, I've got this sort of flashback saying, we do not
Oh,
email
right,
our
oh,
workers.
okay.
Please write to our client.
Okay.
But no, she said at the time that she was interested, very interested in that aspect of the story. So yes, it would be nice. And Bill Oddie as well, his daughter Kate, I'm not sure if he's going to do it now, but his daughter Kate Hardy who's an actor and a filmmaker, is doing the festival. And he's descended from a foreman. But there's all these. It's not surprising there are all these celebrities that are because the East End is such a huge area. So many people come out of the East End, and largest employer of female labour. Not just 1,400 plus in the factory, but thousands working in their homes making matchboxes as well. So, yeah, connections everywhere. Go for it.
Sorry,
No, go for it.
no, I've just really got interested in Batsy's
Yeah.
my own heritage and stuff. So really.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, firstly, why did the press change its tune? Because from what you said, it seems, maybe it's time restrictions, but you said at first they attacked them as kind of these harlots and stuff like that.
Pretty much.
And then suddenly it seemed to jump from there to, they got pressure and the Lords was supposed to react. But if the media thinks they're harlots and they're kind of these irrational women, then how did that change happen and where did it come from if you get Time supporting them?
Yeah, largely there was an independent report, Toynbee Hall, saying, well, there's a huge debate in the press. Is Annie Besant telling the truth? Is she lying? She's already quite a notorious woman, Annie Besant, so there's a lot of people hanging up at her as well, for many reasons. So Toynbee Hall say, all right, we'll go to investigate, we'll do this completely independently, we'll go and see what conditions are really like at Bryant May, and they conclude they're far worse than Annie Besant said. So in some ways she was wrong. They're far, far worse. This is accepted, this is generally accepted, and this causes massive embarrassment to everybody. Really also it's journalists going onto the site and actually talking to the women, which was quite an unusual thing, as I say, for journalists to do, to talk to women like this. They're quite impressed. They go to mass meetings and they say, well, do you know, not only can they speak English, some of them, practically, but they're really good. They stand up for each other. They're all saying, I can lend you some money, or I can pawn this for you, I can help you out. And they're really impressed. And they hear the women speaking. And they're realising that the idea everyone has at this point, that this underclass is sort of terrifying, outcast London, you know, really ghastly, subhuman almost. Some people are literally saying that, especially about the Irish, that they're subhuman at this point. Contact with them makes them realise it's not the case. And there are people who've said the strike, the dock strike as well, but this strike really changed the idea about the working woman, because people see, oh good grief, they're just, you know, any kind of prejudice doesn't withstand actual knowledge, does it? They're just like us, they love their children, they want to better themselves, they want everyone to benefit from their actions. So yeah, it's really just hearing their side of it, plus this investigation from Toynbee Hall and more stuff coming out, which is very, very embarrassing for Bryant May. At first, Bryant May just believed, because they're gentlemen. I think it's the East End News that says, or the East London Advertiser that says, but they're gentlemen, and they tell us that everything's fine, and their employment practices are really good. Now, for a gentleman's word was his bond in those days. That was enough. It must be true. When the Bryants talk to the Sweating Commission, it's the same thing. It's extraordinary nowadays to read, you know, a government commission is pretty hard hitting these days, one hopes. But they're sort of Bryant May, would you say you're a marvellous employer? Well, yes, I would, thank you. And that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for coming, you know, bow, scrape. His word is taken as his bond because he is a gentleman. And the women must be lying. But there's just more and more evidence builds. And Annie Besant does help, no question, she helps. She's dragged into it, but once she's dragged into it, she does fight back. And she has a big row with the Bryant May management in the pages of the Times, where they accuse her of lying, and she brings evidence and so forth. So, yeah, combination of factors, really.
I think that, well, you see that maybe with the dock strike, because it you know, becomes like a huge, you know, kind of social movement.
Absolutely.
Almost, you know, kind of in the East End, you know, kind of that, with the sort of Catholic Church and the Cardinal getting involved in it, and whatever. I mean, you know, it's a real sort of, you know, and they also have these huge processions.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
through the
marching bands,
the city and
bands
and
yeah.
what's it. And the thing everybody says is that the public opinion swings massively in favour of them.
Exactly.
So it's probably also linked that people were really frightened. I mean, they were becoming aware of the social problems in the East End, and they could, if you like, you know, ruling class people, at least, or upper class and middle class people, could see how dangerous all this was, and that it was an explosive sort of, you know, situation, and therefore, you know, if they didn't want a revolution, they'd have to reform something.
I'm afraid that is true. A lot of reformist talk at this time is very much, oh bloody hell, you know, they're gonna rise up, do something. It's not sort of, you know, we really should do this out of the goodness of our hearts. It's very much keep them quiet. They certainly knew what conditions were like in the East End, but it tended to be when there was something that overspilled into respectable London, like cholera. That's when people would suddenly start throwing a bit of money at the East End. And as Charles Dickens said, it's absolutely appalling the way that the working class in the East End has been neglected and just left to die by other classes, and we're all really guilty of wholesale murder if we don't do more to help them. But it's said at this time that the East End becomes so cut off, even though it's right there in the middle of London, because of railways. Anyone with any money moves out to the suburbs and comes back in for work, but you know, the steam trains are very grotty, very grimy, they get the heck out as soon as they can. And the East End's just left to get on with it, with no infrastructure, left to starve, really. And it said that, you know, the respectable classes couldn't find the East End on a map. If you had the map of London, they couldn't tell you where the East End was. But people would, there was sort of a tourism, a sort of poverty tourism as well, where policemen would take you in small groups into the East End and sort of point at the poor people. And, you know, people were quite scared and looking back. This is a very dangerous street. And you know, it was written about as the exotic East, as if it was this strange sort of other land, you know, fueled by these weird creatures that were almost human. It's really quite astonishing. And as you say, exposure to these people through this and through the dock strike. Somebody said about the dock strike, we see the dry bones stand on their feet and live an exceeding great army. And we thought these were just hardly alive, you know, half dead sort of. And now we suddenly see that they've got aspirations and hopes and dreams just like the rest of us. So, you know, really, you can't underestimate how important it is what these people did in the East End, how they turned the tide. dungeon you decide. It's fine.
Well, I think maybe we should wrap
I'll
up.
let you go. Yeah.